In 1940, as Europe burned and Hitler's armies swept across the continent, another invasion was unfolding thousands of miles away. Not in Europe, not in Africa, but in a small tropical land the world barely noticed. Japan was moving into Vietnam, and no one was paying attention. What began as a quiet occupation would ignite revolutions, topple empires, and reshape Asia forever. This is the forgotten front of a World War II. By the summer of 1940, Japan had been fighting in China for 3 long years. Victories were costly, and Tokyo's war machine was starving for oil, rubber, and iron. Those resources lay in Southeast Asia in the colonies of France, Britain, and the Netherlands. Then everything changed. In June 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany. Its colonies in Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia were suddenly isolated. No reinforcements, no defense. To Japan's military planners, it looked like a gift from the gods. Tokyo moved quickly. They told the new Vichy French government, "Let us enter northern Vietnam to block Chinese supply routes or face invasion." It was a threat disguised as diplomacy, and Vichy cut off and weak reluctantly agreed. But Japan had no intention of stopping at the border. On September 22, 1940, Japan attacked. 30,000 troops crossed the border from China into northern Vietnam, the region called Tonkin. They hit the French stronghold at Lang Son with overwhelming force. The defender colonial soldiers from Vietnam, Laos, and a few hundred French officers fought bravely but hopelessly. Japanese tanks thundered through the jungle roads. Airplanes bombed the fortifications. Within 3 days, Lang Son fell. Hundreds were killed. The rest surrendered or vanished into the hills. A French officer later wrote, "We were fighting ghosts in the jungle. They came from everywhere." The Japanese apologized, calling it a misunderstanding. Then they kept marching right toward Hanoi. By the end of September, the French signed a humiliating truce. Japan had taken northern Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. A front most of the world never noticed had just opened. Officially, France still ruled Indochina. In reality, Japan pulled the strings. Vichy officials wore their white colonial uniforms, but Japanese officers dictated every move, trade, transport, military planning. It was an occupation in all but name. Hanoi streets filled with Japanese troops. New airfields sprang up across the north. Rice harvests were seized to feed Japan's armies. And the French, they could only pretend. They kept their flags flying even as Tokyo decided how much fuel they received each week. It was one of history's strangest arrangements, an empire occupied by another empire, both claiming control while the local people paid the price. By 1941, Japan had expanded southward, taking bases near Saigon. That move alarmed Washington and London. The United States saw what was coming. If Japan controlled Vietnam, its bombers could reach British Malaya and the Philippines. The U.S. responded with a devastating embargo, cutting off Japan's access to oil and steel. Tokyo now faced a deadly countdown. Within 2 years, its fuel reserves would run dry. Desperation set in. To survive, Japan needed new oil in the Dutch East Indies. But to get there, it would have to fight at America and Britain. 5 months later, Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor. The attack that brought America into the war had its roots here in Vietnam. While the world fought in Europe and the Pacific, Vietnam suffered in silence. The Japanese and the Vichy French drained the land dry. They took rice from peasants, converted farmland to jute for uniforms, and let the countryside starve. In 1944, nature struck. 2 floods destroyed crops, transport lines collapsed. The result was one of the worst famines in modern history. Over 1 million Vietnamese died. Entire families vanished. Eyewitnesses described corpses lining the roads, villages abandoned to silence. A survivor recalled, "We sold everything, even our homes, for a handful of rice." But from that suffering came fury. Across the countryside, resistance groups began to rise. Some fought for France, others for independence. They hid in jungles, ambushed patrols, gathered weapons. By early 1945, Japan's empire was crumbling, and Vietnam was ready to strike back. In March 1945, desperate and suspicious, Japan turned on its ally. They disarmed the French garrisons overnight, killing hundreds, imprisoning thousands. The illusion of cooperation was over. Vietnam was now fully under Japanese control, but not for long. 5 months later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki fell to atomic fire. Japan surrendered unconditionally. In Hanoi, a new flag rose red and gold, and the age of empires in Asia began to end. What started as a quiet invasion in 1940 had unleashed a storm that would last for decades. Europe remembers Dunkirk. America remembers Pearl Harbor. But few remember the rice fields of Vietnam, where World War II quietly reshaped the future of an entire continent. From this forgotten front came the collapse of empires and the birth of nations. This was the forgotten front of World War II.